I rolled up the driveway, my heart sinking as the empty space where my wheelchair ramp once stood mocked me in the afternoon light. Ugly, that's how she had described it. The ramp that had been my lifeline, stripped away without my consent, all for the sake of her perfect image. But what Lydia didn't know was that I had a different plan. She thought she could erase my dignity. What she didn't realize was that the beauty she craved was about to cost her everything. Before we begin, may I ask where in this big beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun painted the modest Tampa bungalow in orange gold as Clara Jennings wheeled slowly up the walkway, her hands aching from the push. The familiar grind of her wheelchair wheels over the concrete was usually softened by the smooth incline of her ramp, but today the incline wasn't there. Clara blinked once, twice. Her heart stopped. The ramp, the sturdy oak boards she depended on every single day, was gone. In its place, only a patch of trampled grass and scuffed dirt remained, as though it had never existed. Her throat tightened. No, no, no. She rolled closer, staring at the raw bolts still jutting from the porch like broken teeth. It was gone, and with it, her freedom. The front door swung open with a sharp creak. Lydia Jennings stepped out, flawless blonde hair caught in the dying light, a smug smile tugging at her lips. In her manicured hands, she held a glass of chilled rosé, condensation sliding down the stem. "It ruined the look of the house," Lydia announced, her voice sing-song but sharp enough to cut. "Ugly thing, made the place look like a nursing home." Clara's grip tightened on her wheels. She could feel the muscles in her forearms burning. Behind Lydia, Evan appeared, half hidden in the doorway. Her son's eyes darted between them, filled with shame, but his shoulders slumped in that familiar defeated way. "Evan," Clara rasped, her voice shaking, "tell me this isn't real." He gave a helpless shrug, palms turned upward, as though surrendering. "It was just sitting there, Mom." Lydia thought, Clara snapped, her voice hard as stone. She tried to push herself up the porch step, the front wheel catching sharply against the rise. Her body lurched forward, almost pitching her onto the concrete. Pain shot through her wrists as she steadied herself. She hated giving them the satisfaction of seeing her struggle, hated the indignity of it. Lydia didn't flinch. If anything, her smile widened. From across the hedge, a door slammed. Nancy Brewer, her best friend and neighbor of 30 years, marched across the lawn like a storm brewing over the Gulf. Her white hair, cropped short, caught the sunlight, and her sandals smacked hard against the pavement with each step. "What in God's name have you done?" Nancy barked, pointing an accusing finger at Lydia. "You don't just rip out a woman's wheelchair ramp. That's illegal. Cruel, downright criminal." Lydia's laugh was light, airy, dripping with disdain. "Oh, Nancy, don't be dramatic. It was hideous. The house looks so much better without it." Clara's pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to scream, to shake her son, to shove that glass of wine down Lydia's perfect throat. Instead, she let silence carry her fury. The silence made Lydia shift her weight slightly, just enough to betray unease. Nancy moved closer, standing protectively beside Clara's chair. "You listen to me," Nancy hissed. "You've crossed a line you won't be able to uncross." Clara raised her chin. Her voice came out soft, steady, and far more dangerous than a shout. "Then let's make it uglier for her." Lydia blinked. For the first time, a crack flickered through her mask of confidence. Clara reversed her chair, slowly and deliberately, every movement controlled. She refused to give Lydia the show of seeing her fight the porch again. Instead, she wheeled back down the path toward her own side door, Nancy's hand resting lightly on her shoulder as if anchoring her. Inside, the bungalow felt cooler, dimmer, the faint scent of old flowers still clinging to the air, a ghost of Clara's past life as a florist. She moved toward the hall cabinet, the one she hadn't touched in years. Her hands trembled not from weakness, but from a gathering fire inside her. The cabinet groaned open. Inside lay folders, yellowing paper, decades of neatly organized records. Clara pulled them free. Property deeds, copies of insurance policies, HOA guidelines she had saved out of habit. She spread them across the dining table, her chair pulled close like a commander at war council. Nancy hovered at her side, arms crossed. "What are you doing?" Clara's lips curved into a thin smile. Her eyes, once damp with humiliation, now burned with clarity. "Lydia thinks this is about what's pretty." Her finger tapped against the thick HOA binder with a sharp thud. "It's not. It's about what's written." The brittle pages crackled under her touch, each one whispering possibilities. Clara leaned forward, reading line by line, her pulse steadying with each discovery, and when she reached the section that proved Lydia had broken more than courtesy, that she had broken law, her smile deepened. "This," Clara murmured, her voice barely audible, but carrying the weight of a vow. "This is how we bury her." The dining table looked less like a place for family meals and more like a war desk now. Papers spread across the wood in layered stacks, property deeds, aging insurance forms, and the thick HOA binder that smelled faintly of mildew. Clara's hands, veined and unyielding, smoothed each page as if brushing dust from a weapon. Nancy stood behind her, glasses perched low on her nose, flipping through the bylaws with sharp impatience. "Here, look at this." She jabbed her finger at a paragraph buried halfway down the page. "Any modification affecting accessibility requires prior approval from both the homeowner and the HOA board. Removal without approval. Automatic violation." Clara leaned in, eyes narrowing. The words were dry legalese, but to her they read like justice. "So she didn't just take wood and screws. She broke the rules that protect me." "Exactly," Nancy said, slapping the binder shut. "She thinks she's clever, but these rules are older than her manicure habits." Clara's lips tightened. Her voice came low, steady. "She thinks this is about looks. It's about law." She shifted to another folder, pulling out her insurance paperwork. The paper crinkled under her hands, the ink faded but still legible. "Here, listen to this." Clara murmured. "All primary residences must maintain compliance with ADA accessibility standards for insured parties. If she removed the ramp, she jeopardized not only my access, but their coverage." Nancy's brows shot up. "You're telling me she just put her entire home at risk of losing coverage?" "Worse," Clara said. "If something happens, if I fall, if a fire breaks out, they'll find she tampered with accessibility. That's fraud." The room went quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then Nancy smiled, a grin slow and wolfish. "I know a man who loves this kind of fight." The next afternoon, Clara found herself wheeling into a modest office tucked near downtown Tampa. The brass plaque read Paul Redmond, attorney at law. Inside, the faint scent of coffee mingled with paper and toner, walls lined with framed legal victories, gave the place a subtle gravitas. Paul Redmond rose from his desk as they entered, tall and lean, his salt and pepper hair swept neatly back. His handshake with Nancy was brief, but when he bent down to shake Clara's hand, he looked her directly in the eye. Nancy wasted no time. "Paul, this is Clara." Her daughter-in-law tore out her wheelchair ramp without permission. HOA bylaws were broken. Insurance compromised. Paul's brows arched. "That's not just a nuisance, that's liability." He settled back into his chair, steepling his fingers. "You're not dealing with a family spat. You're sitting on leverage. A big one." Clara studied him. "Will you help me?" A slow smile curved his lips. "We won't just get your ramp back, we'll bankrupt her ego." For the first time since discovering the ramp missing, Clara felt her chest loosen. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about reclaiming power. That night, Lydia hosted dinner as if nothing had happened. She wore pearl earrings that gleamed under the dining room light, her smile as polished as the silverware she laid out. Evan hovered nervously, pouring wine, while Clara sat silently at the far end, the papers she had copied still burning in her bag. As the plates clinked and conversation lulled, Lydia leaned back in her chair, swirling her glass with theatrical elegance. Her voice was dripping with smugness. "I'll never let that ramp ruin my house again." Clara didn't respond, but her hand brushed the folder on her lap, the one Paul had marked with sticky notes. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was the sound of a storm gathering. The chandelier above the Jennings dining table glowed too bright, its light bouncing off polished cutlery and gleaming wine glasses. Clara sat at the far end, her wheelchair parked neatly, as though Lydia had allowed her presence like another piece of furniture. The roasted chicken on her plate smelled of rosemary and garlic, but to Clara it might as well have been ash. Lydia dominated the table as though she were hosting dignitaries. Her manicured hand swept through the air with each word, pearl earrings glinting. "I can't tell you how many neighbors have stopped by just to compliment the clean yard. Finally the house looks presentable." Her smirk traveled across the table, landing on Clara like a knife. Evan chuckled nervously, his fork clinking against the plate. He sipped his wine too quickly, nearly choking on it. "Yeah, looks nice." Clara cut her chicken into precise silent bites, though her stomach tightened with each swallow. She had no appetite, not for the food, not for the performance Lydia was staging. Every neighbor's compliment Lydia claimed felt like another slap. Clara kept her expression neutral, her fury tucked deep, tasting of iron and restraint. Nancy, invited only because Clara insisted, rolled her eyes and stabbed at her salad. "People will say anything to your face. Doesn't mean they respect you, Lydia." Lydia's laugh rang sharp as glass. "Respect comes from beauty, Nancy. Something you wouldn't understand." Clara's hand twitched against her lap. She wanted to speak, to slice through Lydia's vanity with words sharper than any knife. Instead, she let silence stand as her rebellion. Silence was stronger, it unsettled Lydia more than shouting ever could. Meanwhile, in an office across town, Paul Redmond slid a neatly prepared notice into a courier's envelope. The words printed in black ink were simple but devastating. "Violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Immediate action required." He signed it with a flourish, a quiet promise that Lydia's smugness was on borrowed time. Nancy had been there when Paul filed it, practically bouncing in her chair. "That's the appetizer," she'd whispered gleefully. "Wait until she chokes on the entree." Back at dinner, Lydia raised her phone between courses, angling it to capture the candlelight bouncing off polished surfaces. She framed the wine glasses, the immaculate table, the bare porch visible just beyond the sliding glass doors. "Perfect house, perfect dinner," she cooed as she tapped the post button. "My friends online will die when they see how spotless it all looks." Clara clenched her jaw. The woman wasn't content just to humiliate her privately. She needed an audience. Nancy leaned toward Clara, whispering just low enough that only she could hear. "She thinks this is her victory lap. Wait until she sees what's waiting on her porch." Clara's lips curved into the faintest smile. She didn't need to remind Lydia that beauty fades. Paper, however, legal paper, was permanent. As the plates cleared and dessert was served, Lydia basked in her imagined triumph. "Honestly, I don't know why you ever insisted on that ramp," she said breezily, slicing into her cake. "I mean, everyone gets by just fine with stairs." Clara looked at her son. Evan's face reddened as he lowered his eyes, shoveling cake into his mouth like a man desperate for distraction. Clara spoke at last, her voice quiet but edged. "Some things aren't about convenience, they're about dignity." The words silenced the room for a heartbeat. Then Lydia scoffed, waving her fork dismissively. "Spare me the dramatics." The evening ended with forced smiles and clinking dishes, but Clara's heart beat steadily, calmly, because she knew what Lydia didn't. While Lydia flaunted her false victory, the storm had already been set in motion. The very next morning, a uniformed courier strode up the walkway, ignoring Lydia's carefully arranged potted plants. He tucked a crisp white envelope against the front door, stamped boldly with official HOA correspondence. By the time Lydia opened it, still in her silk robe, Clara and Nancy were already sipping coffee next door. The Florida sun streamed through the blinds as Lydia's scream carried across the hedge. The HOA had delivered its first warning letter. Fines were pending. The morning heat clung heavy in Tampa, humidity wrapping the neighborhood like a damp blanket. Clara sat on her porch, the whirring of her small desk fan fighting the sluggish air, when she saw Lydia strut down the walkway with the envelope clutched in her perfectly manicured hand. The bold official HOA correspondence stamp was unmistakable. Clara straightened in her chair, gripping her wheels, her pulse quickening. This was it, the first blow. Lydia stopped at the edge of Clara's porch, holding the letter high as if it were some kind of trophy. "Your friends at the HOA had a little message for us," she said, her smile tight and poisonous. She tore the seal in one vicious motion and unfolded the paper. Her eyes skimmed the page, the smirk faltering only for a heartbeat before snapping back into place. Then, with deliberate slowness, Lydia crumpled the letter, ripped it straight down the middle, and again, until the page became confetti in her hands. "Worthless," she spat, letting the pieces drift into Clara's lap before brushing her hands together like a magician finishing a trick. The scraps fluttered onto the porch floor, sticking briefly in the damp air before settling against the welcome mat. Clara didn't flinch. She reached calmly for the phone resting on her tray and with a single click, captured the evidence, Lydia's hand tearing the official notice, the shredded pieces strewn across the porch, the date and time stamped in the corner of the photo. Lydia caught the motion and bristled. "Oh please, what are you going to do? Scrapbook it?" Clara met her gaze with a faint smile. "Something like that." That afternoon, Clara rolled into Paul Redmond's office with Nancy at her side. The shredded letter, carefully scooped into a Ziploc bag, sat on her lap. She slid both the bag and her phone across his desk. Paul examined the photo, then the torn fragments, and let out a low whistle. "She really did this right in front of you. Made a show of it," Clara said, her voice steady but tight. Paul leaned back in his chair, tapping the bag against his palm like a gavel. "This is textbook non-compliance. She's not just ignoring the warning, she's destroying evidence of it. Courts eat this alive." Nancy chuckled darkly. "Stack it higher, Clara. She's handing you bricks to build the wall she'll smash into." Clara's lips curved. Each humiliation Lydia dealt was only fuel, and each reckless act was another stone in her downfall. Over the next week, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip as the HOA fines began to accumulate. Every day Lydia ignored the notice, another charge stacked onto the total. The numbers multiplied with a mechanical cruelty: $100, $200, $400. Clara watched the meter climb like a silent scoreboard of revenge. Sometimes she would hear Lydia through the open window, laughing with her online friends about how the HOA couldn't possibly enforce the fine. "They're bluffing," she'd sneer into her phone. "What are they going to do, arrest me for landscaping?" But the HOA wasn't bluffing. Clara knew it, Paul knew it, Nancy knew it, and soon Lydia would too. One sticky afternoon, Clara returned from the mailbox to find a thick envelope addressed in bold black ink, "Jennings Residence, Statement of Unpaid Fines." Her hands trembled slightly as she tore it open, the paper crinkling beneath her fingers. Her eyes widened at the total, several pages long, each line an added day of defiance. The fines had ballooned into the thousands, a sum big enough to choke any household budget, let alone Lydia's carefully curated facade of perfection. Clara exhaled slowly, the corners of her mouth curling upward. She placed the letter neatly on the table beside the others, her growing archive of Lydia's arrogance. Nancy arrived minutes later, bringing sweet tea and sharp words. Clara slid the statement across the table without a word. Nancy read it, let out a low whistle, and burst into laughter that rattled the blinds. "She has no idea what storm she's standing in," Nancy said. "By the time she looks up, she'll already be drowning." Clara folded her hands in her lap, the fine print still gleaming in her mind like a dagger. Lydia had shredded one letter, thinking it would vanish with the scraps. Instead, she had only sharpened Clara's resolve. And now thousands of dollars hung over Lydia's perfect house like a thundercloud ready to burst. The sound of Lydia's laughter carried across the hedge like nails dragged over glass. Clara sat in her garden, trimming dead heads from her roses, while Lydia boasted to a neighbor on the phone. Hundreds. Please, Lydia sneered loudly enough for Clara to hear. The HOA sends letters to everyone. It's all bluff. They can't actually enforce this nonsense. Clara clipped another stem, the sweet smell of roses drifting into the humid air. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Inside Paul Redmond's office, however, silence wasn't part of the plan. Paul leaned forward over his mahogany desk, glasses low on his nose as he flipped through the file of accumulating fines. She's up past 3,000, he muttered, voice sharp. And she hasn't paid a dime. Nancy slapped the desk with the flat of her palm. Good, let her keep laughing. Paul adjusted his tie, a wolfish grin spreading. It's time to escalate. If she won't respect letters, she'll respect liens. We'll attach them to the property. Every unpaid fine becomes a nail in her coffin. Back at the house, the nails began to bite. Evan found the notice first, pulling it from the mailbox with trembling hands. His face blanched as he read the bold line, lien notice, Jennings residence. He stormed inside, waving the paper like a white flag. Lydia, he stammered. This is serious. They've put a lien on the house. Lydia perched at the breakfast bar with her laptop open to a shopping site, barely glanced up. They're bluffing, Evan. That's all they do, bluff. No, he insisted, slamming the paper onto the counter. This isn't just a letter. If we don't pay, we could. Could what? Lydia snapped, slamming the laptop shut. Lose the house. You think your precious mother would go that far? She's doing this on purpose. She wants to ruin me. Evan's voice cracked. Maybe she doesn't have to do anything. Maybe you're ruining yourself. The kitchen went still. Lydia's face flushed a furious red, her chest rising and falling like a cornered animal's. Next door, Clara knelt beside her garden bed, hose in hand. The water hissed softly, soaking the soil around the bright marigolds. The air smelled of wet earth and citrus blossoms carried by the breeze. She hummed faintly, a tune that masked the sounds of Lydia's rage seeping through the walls. Nancy leaned over the fence, sipping iced tea. Debt looks ugly too, she said with a chuckle. And uglier still when it starts showing in their faces. Clara smiled, misting her roses as though nothing in the world could trouble her. But trouble had only begun. Later that week, Paul called Clara into his office again. Papers were spread across his desk, copies of HOA records Lydia had submitted. He slid one toward Clara, his expression grim. I thought I'd seen everything, Paul said, tapping the page with a pen. But this is bold. Clara leaned closer, eyes narrowing as she scanned the document. At the bottom in neat cursive was her own name, Clara Jennings. The problem was, she had never signed it. Paul's gaze hardened. She forged your signature. She claimed you gave her permission to remove the ramp. Nancy let out a gasp sharp enough to rattle the blinds. That woman didn't just dig her grave. She borrowed your shovel to do it. Clara's hands gripped the armrests of her chair, her composure icy and controlled. She stared at the false signature, the looping letters that mocked her very name, and exhaled slowly. She took my ramp, Clara said, voice flat and steady. Now she's taken my name. Paul leaned forward, eyes gleaming with the thrill of the case. And that, he said, will cost her more than any fine. The paper lay between them, a false signature, waiting to become the weapon that would turn Lydia's arrogance into full-blown fraud. The meeting hall smelled faintly of lemon polish and nervous sweat. Folding chairs scraped against the tile floor as HOA board members filed in, clutching clipboards and bottled water. At the front of the long table, Lydia sat with arms crossed, dressed in a coral blazer far too loud for the setting, her posture rigid with brittle confidence. Evan lingered behind her, shoulders hunched, his tie crooked as if he had dressed in a rush. Clara wheeled in beside Paul Redmond, her presence calm, deliberate. She placed a small folder on the table before her, as if setting down a weapon. Nancy flanked her like a general's lieutenant, eyes sharp, daring anyone to underestimate them. Paul wasted no time. He laid the forged document flat on the table, his voice steady but laced with steel. This, he said, sliding the paper toward the board president, is what Mrs. Lydia Jennings submitted. She claimed her mother-in-law, Miss Clara Jennings, gave written consent to remove the accessibility ramp. The room rustled with murmurs. Lydia flipped her hair and smirked. Exactly, she agreed. I have the paperwork to prove it. Paul's lips curved in the faintest smile. You mean this paperwork, because we're prepared to demonstrate it's a fraud. Clara wheeled forward, pulling 3 sealed envelopes from her folder. She opened the first and spread a notarized document across the table. The signature was neat, flowing, and indisputably hers. Then another, a bank form with her signature repeated in triplicate. And finally the deed to her home, the ink crisp, stamped by a notary's seal. Each example bore a steady grace to the loops of her name, grace absent from the jagged scrawl at the bottom of Lydia's form. Paul placed the forged page beside Clara's genuine ones. The contrast was undeniable. Notarized records don't lie. The signature Lydia provided doesn't even match her victim's handwriting. This is forgery, plain and simple. The HOA president, a man with silver hair and tired eyes, leaned in, his lips tightened as he studied the documents. Mrs. Jennings, he said, turning to Lydia, do you have any explanation for this? Color crept into Lydia's cheeks. She's just trying to embarrass me. Maybe her handwriting changes when she's stressed. People's writing changes all the time. Clara's laugh was low, cutting, the sound of glass breaking in a quiet room. She looked Lydia dead in the eye. You stole my ramp. Now you've stolen my name. But I promise you, I'll steal your peace. Evan shifted beside his wife, his hands twisting the tie he had never fixed. Lydia, maybe just admit it. They'll go easier if you— Shut up, Evan. Lydia snapped, her voice cracking under the weight of the room's judgment. The board murmurs grew louder, anger rippling like a storm tide. Nancy leaned forward, her voice sharp as a whip. She thought she could bury evidence in shredded paper. Now she's buried herself in fraud. The HOA president slammed the gavel against the table. Enough. This board finds Mrs. Lydia Jennings in gross violation of our bylaws. Given the forgery and willful destruction of notices, penalties will be doubled, effective immediately. The air seemed to vibrate. Lydia gasped, eyes wide, mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. Evan sagged into his chair, rubbing his face with both hands. Clara said nothing more. She didn't need to. Her silence, her poise in the mountain of paper spoke louder than rage ever could. Paul leaned toward her, his whisper low and certain. We've got her where we want her. Next stop is court. As if summoned by fate itself, the board's secretary entered moments later, a manila envelope clutched in his hand. He looked around nervously before placing it in front of Paul. The seal bore the stamp of the county clerk. Paul slid it across to Clara. She opened it slowly, deliberately. Inside lay a crisp summons, fraud and damages hearing, Tampa Civil Court. Nancy's eyes gleamed. Well, she muttered, looks like dessert just arrived. The HOA meeting hall buzzed with chatter, folding chairs scraping the floor as neighbors filed in. The air smelled faintly of dust, coffee from a percolator in the corner, and the tang of too much perfume. Clara wheeled herself into the room with Nancy by her side, her hands steady on the rims, her heart pounding not from nerves but from anticipation. Lydia was already seated at the front, perched stiffly on a chair like a queen stripped of her throne. She wore a navy blazer over a white blouse, every hair lacquered into place, though a faint sheen of sweat betrayed the cracks beneath her polish. Evan sat beside her, looking smaller than ever, his tie askew, his gaze fixed on the floor. Paul Redmond carried his briefcase with the casual confidence of a man who already knew how the evening would end. He set it on the table with a satisfying thud and began unpacking his evidence like a magician about to perform a devastating trick. The HOA president cleared his throat into the microphone. We're here to address the matter of Mrs. Lydia Jennings and the removal of a wheelchair ramp, as well as subsequent documentation submitted to this board. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience. Neighbors leaned closer, whispers cutting like wind through grass. Clara recognized faces she had lived beside for years. Retirees, young couples, parents juggling toddlers. All of them here watching. Paul stepped forward. He spread copies of the forged document across the table for the board, and projected a blown-up version on the screen. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the form Mrs. Jennings submitted, claiming her mother-in-law gave permission to remove her wheelchair ramp, and here, he tapped the corner of the screen, is the signature, except it's not hers. The silence was sharp brittle. Then Paul pulled out Clara's notarized samples and placed them side by side. The difference was stark. The elegance of Clara's handwriting against the clumsy imitation on Lydia's form. This isn't just vandalism or negligence, Paul continued, his voice rising like a hammer. This is fraud. Documented, undeniable fraud. A woman in the back gasped audibly. A man shook his head. Conversations broke out in hushed tones. She forged her mother-in-law's name. Who does that? Nancy stood then, her presence commanding as she faced the room. She didn't just rip out wood and nails, Nancy said, her voice carrying with the ease of someone who had once sat on this very board. She ripped out dignity. She hid a wheelchair ramp, an accessibility lifeline, because she thought it was ugly. That's who she is. The murmurs grew louder, sharper. One neighbor whispered, I always wondered why Clara struggled on that porch. Another muttered, disgusting. Heads shook, lips curled, eyes narrowed, all of it aimed at Lydia. Lydia's composure shattered. She stood abruptly, her chair screeching across the tile. This is slander, she shouted, her voice high-pitched, desperate. You're all ganging up on me, because Clara likes to play the victim. None of you understand how hard I worked to make that house beautiful. But her words only fueled the disgust. A neighbor snorted, another scoffed aloud. Evan reached for her arm, whispering something that went unheard. Lydia yanked away, her eyes wild, her voice breaking. Clara remained silent, watching with a faint, almost imperceptible smile. She didn't need to defend herself. The truth was unraveling Lydia more effectively than any retort ever could. The room itself was her ally. Now Paul closed his folder with deliberate calm. Given the forged documents and the ongoing violations, this matter has surpassed the authority of this board. The case will move to civil court. The HOA president leaned forward, his voice somber but firm. We are forwarding all documentation to the county judge. This board recommends a full trial for damages, restitution, and penalties. The words hit like a gavel. Lydia staggered back into her chair, her mouth open but silent now, as though she had finally run out of lies to prop herself up. Evan buried his face in his hands, shoulders trembling. Nancy reached over and squeezed Clara's hand gently. You don't need to say a thing. She's already lost. Clara's faint smile deepened as she turned her gaze to the screen where her forged name glared back at Lydia like a scarlet letter. Outside the hall, the humid Florida night buzzed with cicadas. Inside, the neighbors whispered and pointed, some with pity, most with contempt, and as the crowd dispersed, a clerk approached Paul with a sealed envelope. He opened it, scanned the first line, and slid it across the table to Clara. In bold letters it read, Trial date scheduled, Civil Court, Tampa, Florida. The courthouse loomed against the Tampa skyline, its pale stone catching the morning sun like a fortress. Clara felt the heat rising from the pavement as Paul guided her up the wide steps, Nancy hovering close behind. The air smelled faintly of sea salt drifting in from the Gulf, and hot asphalt baking under August's glare. Her wheels clicked rhythmically against the tiled floor as they entered. Each turn a declaration, she was not hiding. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with the muted hum of anticipation. The shuffle of papers, the squeak of shoes on polished wood, the faint rattle of air conditioning battling Florida humidity, all of it swelled into a symphony of tension. Clara rolled forward with deliberate calm, her blouse pressed, a silver brooch pinned to her chest. Across the aisle, Lydia sat stiffly in a cream suit that looked better suited for a cocktail party than a courtroom. Diamond studs winked at her ears, and her lips were painted an almost defiant shade of crimson. She smiled too widely, the brittle kind of confidence that cracks with pressure. Evan sat beside her, slouched and silent, his face pale, eyes darting anywhere but the judge's bench. The bailiff called for order, and Judge Harris entered, a man with lined cheeks and sharp eyes that betrayed no patience for theatrics. He adjusted his robes, scanning the room with a hawk's gaze. "Let's proceed." Paul stood calm as ever, his voice even but cutting. "Your Honor, this case isn't about aesthetics or neighborly disagreements. It's about rights. My client, Mrs. Clara Jennings, had her wheelchair ramp removed without consent, then discovered her daughter-in-law submitted falsified documents, claiming Clara approved the removal." The judge's brows knit. "Forgery." Paul nodded, sliding a series of exhibits across. "Here are the so-called consent forms bearing my client's forged signature. And here," he added, laying notarized samples side by side, "are Clara's authentic signatures, verified and witnessed. The differences are glaring." The judge leaned closer, lips tightening. The air in the room thickened. Lydia crossed her legs with exaggerated poise, lifting her chin. "Your Honor, this is being blown out of proportion. It's a misunderstanding, that's all." Paul's eyes sharpened. "A misunderstanding doesn't explain why her name was signed in handwriting that doesn't match hers. A misunderstanding doesn't shred HOA letters in front of witnesses. This is fraud. Plain, simple, and documented." Gasps fluttered through the gallery. Clara kept her gaze steady, her hands folded in her lap, calm as stone. Judge Harris turned to her. "Mrs. Jennings, would you care to testify?" Clara wheeled forward slowly. Her palms tingled against the rims of her chair, but her voice, when it came, was clear and steady. "I didn't want to fight. I didn't want money or attention. I just wanted access to my home. I wanted to enter my door without begging for help, without feeling like a burden. My ramp was survival, not decoration, and it was taken from me because someone thought it was ugly." The room stilled, her words hanging heavy in the air. Even Evan shifted uncomfortably, rubbing his jaw as though the weight of guilt pressed too hard. Lydia's composure cracked. She shot up from her chair, voice shrill. "She's lying. She agreed to it. She just doesn't remember. She's always been dramatic." "Enough," Judge Harris barked, slamming his gavel. The crack echoed through the chamber, silencing her like a muzzle. His eyes bore into Lydia, unimpressed. "This court will not tolerate outbursts or baseless accusations." Lydia sank back down, trembling, her lipstick smudged at the corner of her mouth. Evan stared at the floor, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Paul adjusted his jacket, leaning slightly toward the bench. "Your Honor, the fines are unpaid, the fraud is undeniable, and my client deserves more than apology. She deserves restitution." The judge paused, his silence louder than words. Then, in a voice like iron, he said, "This court orders an emergency restitution review. All financial records and penalties will be evaluated immediately." Clara exhaled, her faint smile concealed in the tilt of her head. Lydia gripped Evan's arm, her nails digging in, eyes wide as if she'd just seen her carefully built world start to crack. And for the first time, the courtroom itself felt like Clara's ramp, lifting her higher while Lydia began to sink. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood polish, and the stale coffee of too many long hearings. Judge Harris leaned forward on the bench, his gavel resting beside a thick folder of Lydia's case files. The air was so tense it felt like the whole room was holding its breath. Having reviewed the documents, evidence, and testimony, the judge began, his voice heavy as stone. "This court finds Lydia Jennings guilty of fraudulent conduct, violation of HOA bylaws, and obstruction of compliance under accessibility requirements." The words fell like hammer blows. Lydia shifted violently in her chair, clutching at Evan's sleeve. "No, no. This isn't silence." The judge snapped, his gaze cutting her down. He turned the page in his notes. "Effective immediately, all fines accumulated by the HOA will be upheld. Furthermore, punitive damages for fraud are awarded to Mrs. Clara Jennings. Mrs. Jennings' legal fees will also be covered in full by the defendant." Gasps rippled through the room. Paul remained composed, hands folded, though a satisfied glint burned in his eyes. Clara kept her face calm, but inside she felt the steady swell of vindication. Judge Harris's voice deepened as he delivered the final strike. Given the defendant's failure to pay previous fines, this court enforces the lien on the property. Should the debt remain unpaid, foreclosure proceedings will commence. Evan crumpled against the bench, burying his face in his palms. His shoulders heaved as though the weight of Lydia's arrogance had finally broken him. Beside him, Lydia dissolved. Her coral-painted nails dug into her husband's sleeve as sobs tore through her chest. Mascara streaked her cheeks, her perfect image bleeding black onto her trembling face. "This can't be happening," she wailed, her voice echoing off the paneled walls. Trentive tit, Clara tilted her head slightly, her voice soft but merciless. "It already has." Lydia whipped her head toward her, eyes wild, but Clara didn't flinch. She didn't need to raise her voice or gloat. The words themselves carried enough power to hollow Lydia out. From the gallery, Nancy leaned closer, whispering loudly enough for the nearest rows to hear. "That's a beautiful mess," she said, grinning like a woman who had just watched justice bloom. Lydia covered her ears, rocking slightly as though the words themselves stabbed deeper than the ruling. Evan remained motionless, staring at the floor, a man cracked in two by loyalty and shame. Paul gathered his papers, his calm efficiency almost cruel in contrast to Lydia's unraveling. "This is only the beginning," he murmured to Clara as he slid the folder into his briefcase. Judge Harris banged his gavel. "This court is adjourned." The sound reverberated through the room, final and absolute. The bailiff moved to escort the parties out, but Lydia stayed frozen in her chair, shoulders shaking, eyes staring at nothing. Clara wheeled herself toward the door, Nancy's hand resting briefly on her shoulder. The air outside was heavy with Gulf Coast humidity, the cicadas droning as if mocking Lydia's collapse. Clara drew in a slow breath, savoring it. For once the weight pressing against her chest wasn't fear, it was victory. Hours later, in the fading afternoon light, a white sheriff's cruiser rolled up to Lydia's driveway. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains and half-opened doors, whispers floating like insects on the humid air. The officer stepped out, boots crunching against the gravel, and walked to the porch with deliberate slowness. He pulled a sheet of paper from his folder, smoothed it flat, and taped it directly to the pristine front door. Lydia had been so desperate to keep beautiful. The notice flapped slightly in the coastal breeze, its bold black letters shouting louder than any gossip ever could. Sheriff's order, seizure pending, property at risk of foreclosure. And as the neighbors whispered, Lydia's scream cracked through the evening air, shattering whatever shards of pride she still clung to. The notice clung to Lydia's front door, like a scarlet letter. The sheriff's tape fluttered in the warm Gulf breeze, the black lettering bold enough for anyone walking by to read, "Seizure pending. Property at risk of foreclosure." By mid-morning, the neighborhood had noticed. Curtains twitched. Lawn sprinklers hummed while neighbors lingered too long at their mailboxes, eyes flicking toward the Jennings house. Whispers traveled faster than the cicadas buzzing in the heat. Clara sat on her porch with a glass of iced tea, the condensation sliding over her palm. She didn't need binoculars. The scene unfolded clear as day. Lydia flung open her front door, silk robe clinging to her damp skin, mascara streaking her cheeks from a night of tears. She clawed at the notice with shaking fingers, tearing it down in strips until only scraps of tape remained. Her voice carried across the hedges, shrill and ragged. "They can't do this to me. Not here, not in front of them." A pair of joggers slowed to a near stop, pretending to stretch but staring openly at the shredded paper in Lydia's hand. Another neighbor muttered to his wife as they walked their dog. By noon, half the block knew the queen of appearances had been dethroned. Inside, Evan paced the living room like a man circling a cliff's edge. He ran both hands through his hair, muttering. Finally, he slipped out the back door and crossed the lawn toward Clara's porch. His shirt clung with sweat, his face gray with exhaustion. "Mom," he said softly, stopping at the base of her ramp. His eyes were glassy, his voice unsteady. Please, you've made your point. She's broken, can't you see? If this goes any further, we'll lose everything. Isn't this enough? Clara set her glass down, the ice clinking sharply. She studied him for a long, quiet moment, her gaze steady and unflinching. You didn't step in when she took my ramp. You didn't step in when she forged my name. You want to step in now because the house you love more than me is on the line. Evan's lips parted, but no words came. He looked down at his shoes, shoulders folding inward, and finally trudged back across the lawn like a man already defeated. Nancy appeared a moment later, sliding into the wicker chair beside Clara. She wore oversized sunglasses and carried a grin sharp enough to cut glass. Saw him slinking over here like a guilty teenager, she said. You didn't give in, did you? Clara shook her head, lips curving faintly. No. He asked if this was enough. I told him it wasn't. Nancy clapped her hands once, delighted. Good, because Paul's already drafting the foreclosure expedite paperwork. That house is uglier by the day. As if summoned, Paul's sedan pulled into Clara's driveway not long after. He climbed out with a briefcase and a purposeful stride. His tie loosened in the humid air. The judge's ruling is ironclad, he said, setting the case on Clara's table. But we won't let her drag this out for months. I'm filing the motion to expedite today. Clara nodded, the faint sound of Lydia's sobs carrying faintly across the hedge. Make it quick. Paul's smile was thin but certain. It will be. That night, Lydia sat hunched at her vanity, phone clutched in her hand. Her live stream glowed across her tear-streaked face, pearls still dangling absurdly from her ears. They're jealous, she told the faceless viewers watching her collapse. They can't stand to see someone with standards. This neighborhood has always hated me. The comments scrolled fast and merciless. Ugly house for an ugly heart. You ruined your own life. Try explaining this to a landlord when you're begging for an apartment. Lydia's painted nails hovered over the phone screen, trembling before she slammed it down and buried her face in her hands. The next morning, a courier in a navy blazer strode up the walkway, ignoring Lydia's wild-eyed glare through the curtains. He taped a new notice on the door, this one even heavier than the last. The words were clear, final, undeniable, auction date scheduled, Jennings property, Gulf County Courthouse. The hammer wasn't just falling, it was already in motion. The Gulf County Courthouse lawn buzzed like a hive, a crowd of bidders and gawkers clustering beneath the sprawling oaks. The Florida sun bore down mercilessly, pressing sweat into collars, baking the smell of asphalt and salt air into the gathering. The air was thick with anticipation. The fall of a home always drew spectators. At the center, a makeshift podium had been set up. The auctioneer, a stocky man with a booming voice, adjusted his microphone and shuffled the papers announcing the foreclosure sale of the Jennings property. Lydia stood just outside the courthouse steps, her face pale under layers of foundation. Her blouse clung to her back, damp with sweat, her pearls swinging like a mockery of dignity. She reached for Evan's arm as bidders jotted notes and checked bank apps, their eyes already imagining her house as theirs. Please, she begged, her voice cracking, don't let them take it. Evan, say something, do something. Evan kept his eyes on the ground, lips pressed so tightly they seemed sealed shut. His silence was a verdict harsher than any gavel. Clara rolled forward through the crowd, Nancy striding at her side like a soldier guarding her general. She wore a simple summer blouse, a flower pin fastened neatly to the collar. Her presence drew whispers. Neighbors who once muttered behind fences now stared openly, some nodding with respect. From the courthouse doors, Paul emerged with his briefcase and a partner in tow, a representative from a local charity that specialized in accessible housing. The two men exchanged a glance, then joined the front row of bidders. Paul adjusted his tie, calm as though this were just another day in the office. The auctioneer banged the gavel. Foreclosed property at 218 West Shore Lane, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, 1-car garage, sold as is. Bidding starts at $200,000. Who'll give me $205? Hands shot up. Numbers rolled out fast. 2:15, 2:30, 2:40. The energy in the crowd pulsed like a storm gathering. Lydia stumbled forward, clutching the podium. You can't. This is my home. The auctioneer didn't even glance at her. 250. Do I hear 260? The bids climbed, her pleas drowned in the rhythm of numbers and the pounding of the gavel. She turned to the crowd, tears streaking her cheeks. This is wrong. Someone stop this. Please. Nobody stopped. Paul lifted his hand at 275. The charity partner raised it again at 290. A rival bidder pushed it to 300, only for Paul to counter with a calm, firm gesture. Back and forth it went, Lydia's cries unraveling into guttural sobs as her house was reduced to a game of increments. Finally, at 325, the rival dropped out. The auctioneer slammed the gavel. Sold. To Mr. Redmond and partner, at 325,000. Applause broke out from the sidelines, some mocking, some genuine. Lydia collapsed onto the courthouse steps, her sobs echoing into her palms. Evan sat beside her, his silence complete, his face a mask of shame. Clara turned to Nancy, her lips curving faintly. That's prettier already. Nancy chuckled, her sunglasses flashing in the sunlight. Poetic justice with a price tag. As the crowd dispersed, Lydia remained hunched, clutching the air as though she could hold on to something invisible. Her phone buzzed in her bag, vibrating insistently. With trembling hands, she pulled it free. The screen displayed a notification from her bank, and below it an email subject line she could barely process: bankruptcy filing initiated. Her gasp cut through the humid air, sharp and broken. It wasn't just the house slipping through her fingers now, it was everything. The bankruptcy papers landed with a dull thud on Lydia's glass coffee table, the sound echoing through the nearly empty living room. Gone were the plush rugs, the gleaming vases, the designer couches she once bragged about on social media. Everything of value had been sold, seized, or surrendered. The only thing left was a hollow shell of the life she once flaunted. She sat slumped on a folding chair, the bankruptcy decree trembling in her hands. The words blurred behind her tears. Case finalized. Assets liquidated. Credit terminated. Each line read like a nail hammered into the coffin of her vanity. Evan stood at the window, arms crossed, jaw tight. He didn't look at her, didn't comfort her. His silence was worse than shouting. He muttered finally, voice low and flat. You've ruined us. Lydia's head snapped up, eyes swollen. I ruined us. You stood there and did nothing while she... No. Evan cut in, sharp as broken glass. I stood there while you lied, forged, and mocked. Don't you dare blame this on her. The words punched harder than any court ruling. Lydia's sob dissolved into a strangled gasp, but Evan was already walking toward the door. He didn't slam it. He didn't need to. The quiet click was louder than thunder. Within days, movers hauled what little they could salvage into a dingy one-bedroom apartment on the far side of town. The hallway smelled of mildew and fried food. The carpet was threadbare, the paint peeling in strips. The luxury Lydia once lived for was replaced by buzzing fluorescent lights and the distant sound of neighbors arguing through thin walls. She stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror one night, the fluorescent glow harsh against her skin. The pearls she once wore had been pawned, her once flawless hair sagged without salon treatments. She barely recognized the woman staring back. Meanwhile, Clara's condo bloomed. She redecorated not with extravagance but with warmth, sunlight streaming through open curtains, fresh flowers arranged in every room, cheerful colors replacing the tired beige walls. The air smelled of lavender and cut roses. For Clara, it wasn't about luxury, it was about reclaiming joy. Nancy stopped by one afternoon with a casserole dish in hand, and laughter bubbling out before she even set it on the counter. Your place feels alive again, she said, eyes sweeping the floral arrangements, the gleam of polished wood, the wheelchair ramp outside gleaming under potted geraniums. And you, Clara, you're glowing. Clara chuckled softly, wheeling closer to the table. Funny how peace looks better than pearls. Days later, Nancy hosted a celebratory lunch in her own kitchen. The air smelled of roasted chicken and fresh bread, glasses clinking as neighbors who had once whispered now raised toasts in Clara's honor. Paul stopped by between cases, pressing a hand to Clara's shoulder. You didn't just win, Clara. You set a precedent. Clara raised her glass of lemonade, the ice cubes clinking. Then may it stand as tall as every ramp they try to hide. Across town, Lydia scrolled her phone in her cramped apartment, desperate for validation. But instead of sympathy, she found venom. Her online friends mocked her collapse, screenshots of the foreclosure and bankruptcy papers circulating like wildfire. That's what she gets. Ugly heart, ugly end. She hurled the phone onto the couch, the crack of the screen sharp in the tiny space. Her hands shook, her breath hitched, and then came the final blow. Nancy slid a folded newspaper across Clara's table that evening, the headline bold, merciless, and impossible to miss. Cruel daughter-in-law loses everything in ramp case. Clara smiled faintly as the words sank in. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been published. The restitution check arrived in a plain white envelope, but to Clara it glittered brighter than any jewel. She opened it slowly, the paper crisp beneath her fingers, the numbers bold, undeniable. Years of humiliation, of being dismissed and diminished, had been distilled into hard currency, a tool, not for revenge anymore, for creation. Clara didn't cash it for herself. Instead, she sat with Nancy at her kitchen table, pen scratching across lined paper as she drafted plans. A garden, she said softly, tapping the pen against the page. Not just flowers, vegetables, herbs, benches, shade, a place people can come and heal. Nancy grinned, leaning back in her chair. And ramps. Clara's smile was steady. Everywhere. Within months, a vacant lot near the Gulf transformed. Where weeds once strangled broken concrete, raised beds now overflowed with tomatoes, peppers, and lavender. Wooden trellises bloomed with climbing roses. Butterflies danced between milkweed and marigolds. Wide, smooth ramps arched gracefully between sections, painted cheerful blue and lined with safety rails. The air smelled of earth, basil, and the salt of the sea carried on warm breezes. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew a crowd, families, seniors, children, even city officials. Paul stood at Clara's side, his tie askew but his smile genuine. Nancy snapped photos proudly, shouting at the mayor to stand straighter for the camera. At the garden's entrance stood a bronze plaque. Clara wheeled closer, her breath catching as she read aloud, "In honor of Clara Jennings, for turning cruelty into growth." Applause rippled around her. Tears pricked her eyes, not from sadness, but from the fierce joy of knowing Lydia's attempt to erase her had only etched her name deeper into the city itself. But Lydia couldn't escape the fallout. One Saturday, Clara and Nancy visited the farmer's market near the pier, the air alive with the smell of kettle corn and fresh citrus. That's where they saw her. Lydia stood at a stall in a faded sundress, her makeup smeared, trying to sell costume jewelry from a folding table. No pearls, no polished image, just desperation. Shoppers passed her by, some whispering, some sneering. Nancy leaned down to Clara's ear, smirking. Oh, how the mighty fall. Lydia's eyes met Clara's across the crowd. For a moment rage sparked, but then it fizzled into shame. She looked away quickly, cheeks flaming as if even the Gulf sun couldn't burn hotter. Evan wasn't beside her. Clara learned later he had left, picking up odd jobs at construction sites, moving from couch to couch. Estranged, embarrassed, and worn down, he no longer defended the woman who had dismantled his family. Clara felt no triumph in the sight of Lydia broken. The triumph came later that evening, when she rolled through the garden and saw children racing between rows of sunflowers, their laughter ringing in the air. An elderly couple held hands on a bench shaded by bougainvillea. A young man in a wheelchair tested the smooth ramp, grinning as he raced to the top without a stumble. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in basil and roses. Ugly was temporary. Justice was permanent. Nancy walked beside her, camera in hand, snapping pictures as the sun melted into the Gulf. You did this, Clara. You turned her debt into something beautiful. Clara's gaze drifted toward the bronze plaque, gleaming in the fading light. And beauty, she whispered, will outlive her lies. Back at home, as cicadas buzzed outside her window, Clara pulled out a notebook. The pages were blank, waiting. She smoothed the first one flat, uncapped her pen, and wrote carefully at the top in bold, steady letters, "Ramps and Ruins." The ballroom hummed with energy, chandeliers scattering golden light across rows of white-draped tables. The air smelled faintly of roasted chicken and polished wood, but beneath it pulsed the electricity of anticipation. At the front, a wide stage gleamed, a podium centered beneath the banner, "Tampa Disability Rights Fundraiser." When Clara rolled onto the stage, the room rose with her. The standing ovation was immediate, thunderous, echoing against the vaulted ceiling. She paused, hands resting lightly on the rims of her chair, letting the applause wash over her like sunlight. For years she had been made small. Tonight she filled the hall. Her voice, when it came, was calm but commanding. "I never asked to be in a fight. I only asked for a ramp. A simple thing, access to my own home. But when someone tried to erase that, I realized something: people will erase you if you let them. And so I stopped letting them." The hall fell silent, except for the soft hum of the microphone. Faces leaned forward, eyes glistening. Clara continued, her tone rising with conviction. "What began with wood and nails became a test of dignity. And dignity should never be negotiable. Tonight we're here to make sure no one else has to beg for access that should already be theirs." The applause came again, rolling like a wave. People wiped at their eyes, clutched each other's hands. At the edge of the stage, Nancy stood, beaming, her hands clasped tightly, as if to hold herself steady against the swell of pride. Paul waited just off stage, clapping with a rare, unguarded smile. When Clara returned to him, he bent slightly, speaking low but clear enough for Nancy to hear. "You turned cruelty into precedent, Clara. That's no small thing." She gave him a faint smile, her eyes still bright with fire. Then let it stand taller than she ever imagined. The award was presented next, an engraved crystal plaque heavy with meaning. As the president of the foundation placed it into Clara's hands, murmurs swept through the crowd. "She made justice beautiful," someone whispered, and others echoed it, a ripple of reverence spreading through the hall. Clara lifted the plaque, the lights catching its edges like facets of a jewel. She didn't think of Lydia, or of Evan's silence, or of the ramp that had once been stolen. She thought of gardens in bloom, ramps lined with flowers, and children laughing in places where once only barriers had stood. Later that week, Clara oversaw the installation of a new ramp at her condo. This one wasn't plain or temporary. It gleamed under the sun, sturdy and wide, bordered with planters overflowing with petunias and ivy. Neighbors paused to admire it as they passed, some offering smiles, others quiet nods of respect. Clara wheeled onto it slowly, her hand brushing the blossoms as she reached the top. She paused there, looking out at the street that had once felt hostile, now softened by her triumph. And for the first time, the ramp didn't just feel like survival, it felt like a monument. The morning sun poured over the street, gilding the flowers that lined Clara's ramp. Petunias spilled from planters, their colors vibrant against the pale wood, while ivy curled lazily along the rails. Clara sat midway down the incline, a porcelain cup of chamomile tea resting in her hands, steam curling into the salt-touched Florida air. The ramp creaked faintly under her chair, as if acknowledging her presence, sturdy and alive. Nancy lowered herself into the wicker chair beside her, a tall glass of sweet tea clinking with ice. She let out a loud, unapologetic laugh as she glanced at Clara's yard. "Well, darling, you've turned this whole block into a postcard. People slow their cars just to look at it." Clara smirked over the rim of her cup. "And to think, someone once said it ruined the view." The two women laughed, their voices mingling with the rustle of palm fronds overhead and the distant cry of seagulls drifting in from the Gulf. The air smelled of citrus blossoms from a neighbor's tree, sweet and sharp, blending with the earthy scent of watered soil. Clara's phone buzzed on the armrest. She answered without hurry. Paul's steady voice came through, calm but warm. Clara, I thought you'd like to hear it from me. Case closed. Forever. There won't be any appeals. She's out of moves. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Thank you, Paul. You did the heavy lifting, he said. I just carried the papers. She ended the call and set the phone aside, turning her gaze back to the street. Neighbors passed with dogs on leashes, some waving, some stopping to smile. Once those looks had been pitying or curious. Now they were respectful, grateful. Later that afternoon, Clara pulled a leather-bound notebook from her desk drawer. Inside, her will waited, freshly updated. Her pen scratched across the page as she ensured her grandchildren, not Evan, not Lydia, would inherit what she built. Her legacy wouldn't be squandered on selfishness. It would nurture the next generation. The light shifted as the sun lowered, bathing her ramp in molten gold. The polished wood gleamed as though it carried its own quiet pride. For Clara, it was more than an incline of boards and nails. It was a monument carved from humiliation, patience, and justice. Every flower clinging to its edges told the story of survival rewritten into triumph. Nancy rocked her chair beside her, fanning herself lazily with the day's newspaper. You've won, Clara. Not just against her. Against anyone who ever thought you were small. Clara smiled softly, tilting her head toward the sky, where clouds drifted like slow ships. Small things grow, Nancy, if you give them time. The street settled into evening calm, porches lit, sprinklers hissing, children laughing in the distance. Clara sipped the last of her tea, warmth lingering against her lips, and felt peace bloom where bitterness once lived. Her gaze swept over the ramp one last time, glowing in the twilight like a victory etched into wood. And as the cicadas began their chorus, she whispered the truth that had carried her from humiliation to triumph. She hid my wheelchair ramp because it was ugly, so I beautified her life with nothing but debt notices.